Welcome back to episode 3 of Asian Provocation, and I'm your host, Ayoto Ataraxia. For this episode, we have a conversation that took place back in mid-October with Lulu Yao Gioiello. The season was changing. You can hear the autumn rain, the air moistened, and the leaves softened. Lulu was just coming back to New York from LA. We met for the first time years ago when I photographed Lulu for an advertising campaign. Since then we've kept in touch, exchanging notes, ideas, films and books. She has been releasing an annual cross-cultural book series, Far Near, that broadens perspectives of Asia through image, person, idea and history, with a focus to unlearn the inherent dominative mode. This conversation was recorded back in mid-October 2020, with the onset of a second wave of COVID in Europe. We speak about cinema, books, and also the difficulties of funding, the taboo that surrounds money subjects, and its relationship around creative freedom and independence. There's a lot of interesting references in this conversation to books, films, and music. I will provide the links and information for you in this episode show notes. Has it been helpful to have the COVID focus?
It's hard to say. I think because of it, it was hard for me to get started on it. Right in March, I was just feeling kind of helpless or something. But then when I came back to New York, I kind of got motivated again.
What changed in New York?
I left New York in January before COVID hit. So in a way, it's like normal here, but it felt a bit returning to some normal setting.
I saw this new series that you guys are doing, A Pure Person.
Yeah, a friend of mine, Angela, she's a music or album producer, yes, more on the record label side of things. She's a young Taiwanese American girl who just really wanted to work with them a few years ago.
This is a snippet from Lim Gong's track, A Pure Person, the soundtrack from Taiwanese director Ho Xiaoxian's Millennium Mambo. You may remember the beautiful opening from 2001 film with Shu Qi. I love hear the conversations in Taiwanese. Brings me instantly back to my birthplace.
So she reached out to him in an email and they started working together. She was really trying to push him to get some new music out, but they also kind of just talked a lot about, what a pure person is or what it means today. Also, ironically, he never got really any compensation for that song. So it's kind of strange that something that was pure kind of got mixed into the, complexities of the music industry and artist compensation and all that. But he's in a totally different mindset now, which is kind of interesting. Obviously he's a bit older now and 20 years have passed. So he's gone from kind of in this more underground rave kind of scene to more, he seems to be a lot more into Buddhism and reflection.
I saw some of the Buddhist themes and the Heart Sutra and these kind of issues. And it was interesting because I think last week I was talking to a friend about this idea of purity and also the way that my mom instilled that idea into me when I was a kid, the idea of the blank paper. I was always super disturbed by it, and I think it gave me a lot of stress, this idea of purity. My mother said that my piece of pure white paper is now blotched full of black ink stains. It just always gave me so much anxiety. But I think, of course, it depends on how you look at it.
As if there's no turning back from the taint.
Yeah, the taint. Do you watch any Sion Sono films?
Yeah, I do.
Did you see that one where Oshima, the son of Oshima, interviewed him and he goes on this rant with his painting about purity?
No, I haven't. That sounds interesting though.
This guy is just incredible, even in real life. He brings the camera crew to his studio and he's got this canvas and he goes on this rant as he paints this painting about the idea of purity and about a young girl growing up and then how she gets defiled by different dirty men and just keeps throwing different paint on and drawing this idea of a person.
That sounds interesting.
He keeps provocating a lot of these ideas of purity and teases you with preconception and perverts it in a really fantastic way.
I also saw a documentary with Hayao Miyazaki. And he talked similarly, he really, he just really loves how innocent he thinks children children are. And he thinks that when you're born, you have all these options and you can kind of like become whoever you want. But the moment you take your first breath, you're making a choice. And so you're losing the options that you've not chosen. I don't know if it's necessarily about purity, but I kind of feel like in a way it's the same thing as like being a blank slate and then just kind of narrowing down into kind of set path or chosen path.
Did you ever have that kind of idea instilled into you?
Not really. I mean, actually, like something that comes to mind is more my dad's Italian American. He's really into spirituality, and we practiced like Indian spiritual kind of yogi meditation. But he always would say to me, like, you can change at any point in life. If you look at yourself, separate yourself from your body, and you're looking down at your body and don't like what you see, or you don't like your personality or anything, the choices you're making, that you can always change that you're not attached to any one identity. In a way, I kind of feel like it takes a lot of energy and risk, but I think you can always be a blank slate to an extent if you just are able to detach from certain either choices you've made or characteristics that you've kind of latched onto.
It's nice that your dad instilled that idea when you were young.
Yeah, it's definitely helped me.
I had to come to that conclusion 30 odd years later.
It's definitely a good thing to be reminded of. I'll just every once in a while, like at the end of the night, I'll think about it and be like, all right, if I were to die in my sleep, would I be like happy with what I've done so far? And if not, what can I do to change that and make it more something I'm proud of, comfortable with leaving?
Yeah, I definitely get that sense from you. What do you have for focus for this issue?
This issue's theme is devotion, but I kind of tried to approach it in some more like, obvious ways, as in religion or spirituality or someone who's super dedicated to one genre of things. But also some of the entries are more about the person themselves, and then just seeing what they actually feel devoted by or for, or if they even feel devoted at all to anything. I'm like really excited about this one because I definitely spent longer time on this. Usually the book comes out in July, but this time it's probably coming out in like next month. But I got to speak to so many different people, and I think it's also kind of interesting that, I chose this theme this year when you got to be like really devoted to something to see it through. I think for the last like 6 to 8 months, I think so many people I've talked to have been challenged to feel motivated or challenged to kind of realign what they think is important to them or what's important for them to continue doing. It's kind of resonating with me more this time than the last two. I mean, the last two were great too, but I don't know, it feels kind of all related in a way.
Why would you say this time gave you more meaning than the other two?
I mean, the other two were definitely just like explorations, and I was really just excited to find people, talk to them, create something fun and interesting, which is the same in this issue. But I also just feel like I was going through trying to find what's important for me to produce, and also just see how other people are dealing with this pandemic, and as well as like how they stay inspired. One person I interviewed this time was the musician Shintaro Sakamoto. And that was like a crazy thing because my friend and I just went to his concert in Brooklyn back in, I think, November, December, and then happened to go to a bar that him and his friends went after. So we met him there and did kind of like an impromptu interview in the staircase of the bar. And then I worked with a photographer friend in Tokyo to do a small shoot with him separately. But he's someone who's so interesting because he's been doing music for like decades, and he's kind of like a loner recluse, he's not really trying to get more popular. It was interesting to talk to him because it seems as though, I'm sure he thinks a lot about everything he does, but his answers for the questions were mostly like, I don't know, I just do what I like. I want to make music that I enjoy listening to, and whether it changes or not throughout the years, he doesn't really think about that. And it's kind of inspiring to hear about people who are really doing things they just like really enjoy doing and are devoted to that.
I've been embracing the idea of don't ask why kind of approach. I mean, it also reminds me of my upbringing, but it was so painful for me to just accept a lot of these things, and I could get myself so bogged down on all these questions about things, and then I'm not doing anything because it's just so existentially difficult.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. I mean, I feel like there's a balance between that because I really like to ask questions, but at the same time, I kind of think of it more. I mean, with this book, for instance, like if I really wanted everything to be perfect, I would probably never release a single thing and or be satisfied. And there have been moments where I'm like, oh man, I messed up on this thing and I wish I hadn't printed it yet. Or if I look back, I might get upset if I see something that wasn't perfect. But I also realized the end product in general seems like it's not where you should be relying or putting all of your satisfaction in. It's really more about the process. And I think the process, you learn a lot. And so even if in a way you're asking questions as you're doing something. So it's like, I still want to ask why, but I also still just want to do it at the same time. So you're like learning as you're doing things, make things or kind of do things you're afraid of doing or a little bit nervous about putting yourself out there. And then anything I do bad, if I'm not happy with it, I just try to erase it from my memory. Don't look at it again. Delete the email.
Is there anything really that bad? And I mean, I've kind of been a bit of a recluse and been retracting a lot from thinking a lot about new projects. I realized there was this growing fear and perfectionism that was really crippling me. I feel more and more excited about letting go a lot of these constructs of how things supposed to be. I mean, first, I think I was started by just the understanding that budget-wise or money, it's just getting ridiculous. I feel like we've been through a stage where I really lived through some kind of excess. It was just mad. And today it seems like my whole thing is just trying to do projects where I just can do it all on my own and keep it as simple as possible and not care too much. Because I think most of it's just about my ego anyway.
Yeah, I mean, money is such a touchy subject. It's great when you can, I mean, ideally you have full control over everything, but obviously that usually comes with less investment and like monetarily. And I agree, like you don't need a lot of money to make really beautiful things. It always helps. I've definitely been in a position where I've, self-funded a film or something like that. And it just gets so stressful and limiting when I don't have enough money to like provide the right things for the people I'm working with, but also I don't necessarily have technical expertise to offer a cheaper solution for something. I find that mostly with, video or film, it's always like pretty tough to keep budgets low. But I also agree, like, I don't think you need, hundreds of thousands of dollars for something that ultimately, is probably going to end up on people's phones.
I've been thinking a lot this year with all this time that I have about film and music. So much of it is getting so, I don't know how people are going to function now. I mean, just this project, Pure Person, what's the distribution model there?
So I don't know as much as Angela would. She's really the owner of this project. I'm kind of just helping her get it out there to like the right people. But I don't think they're looking to make any money off of it. From what she's explained to me, like any of the money that they do get is going to charity. So I know she's doing a digital release right now, which is why we like posted a bunch and did an interview. And then in a few months, I think she's planning a vinyl version. But yeah, I'm pretty sure Lim really didn't want to have this be about him making profits. It's more about, I guess, collaborating and coming up with something new.
I definitely believe a lot in these projects too. At the same time, I'm also thinking about these kind of ideas of common idea that you do things that you love pro bono, and then hopefully it will track something later that will be a project that will pay for all your hard work, but then sell your soul somewhere along the line. I just find it also really tiring, this kind of way of living.
Yeah, I agree. I think it can be super tiring. I also think it's important that people realize that that's kind of the reality, because I feel like right now people are starting to talk about it more openly, but I feel like so many, young or not young photographers or artists or filmmakers or musicians like don't realize that a lot of these things cost money, even if it's just like buying equipment and distributing things without investors. Like all these independent magazines in general have some sort of investment or some sort of wealthy background to help support them. Like nothing is for free. Same with photographers. These editorials usually cost at least $2,000, but often even more than that. And not that many people talk about it, which I think is kind of unfair, because someone who's trying to do it with no money is going to think that they're maybe failing or not good enough because they don't have the same kind of resources that others might have. And I mean, for me, like I pay for everything for this book out of pocket. I mean, the reality is I work a full-time job, to pay for it. It's not like it just comes out of people. I mean, people buying the book obviously helps, but that's not the only way that something can survive. It still needs money or like investment from somewhere. Not that it's a good thing. I wish it was different, but I do think it's like important that it's talked about and people realize that people who have finances to pay for something are able to have the more freedom to make something new or different or not that doesn't necessarily pay back monetarily.
I think this conversation is a good starting point. Recently, I've been really thinking about all of these models for the longest, but definitely the last 5 years, companies like Netflix or Spotify, for example, I realize it's just so poisonous. At the same time, it's this kind of lazy model. We've kind of given away so much of our power to these singular monopolies, and it's just become quite impossible for a lot of things to happen unless you go through some of these classic ways of creating and distributing. I think it's really unfortunate because I think it's this idea of independence, also purity in that sense of like how can the voice of the creators be truly what they want to say or do without having the fear of how the funding is coming.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if people feel that way. Personally, I see the difference. Most things for me is just unwatchable on Netflix, and Spotify kind of just pushes a kind of a specific algorithm. And of course, there's ways to move about it. I find it's dumbing down the general population into this singular view of the world.
I definitely feel that way about social media in general as well, like especially Instagram. It's like you can't function without it, but you also don't want to necessarily function within it because it becomes this kind of like washed out version of what you actually want to be making. It's so easy to kind of just fall into things that people will respond well to, but may not be what you're actually trying to put out there. And it's kind of a strange thing because in one way it can like really help. If you work with the system, it can help increase awareness of what you're trying to put out there or create a bigger audience for the things you're creating. But it also means that you have to, or like that only works if you're the way they kind of want you to do it, which are these like very, very aggressive, really short visual like language or opinions, which I really love to like, more thoughtful, long form things that require a bit more attention and energy and thought. And like, I really prefer kind of seeing different perspectives of one subject and not just having this one blanket like opinion on everything within a subject, which I feel like is kind of what Instagram has been doing. Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, social media in general.
Do you have any other points or mediums where you look at more subcultural content?
I'm very into books. I mean, a cool thing that I do find from Instagram is sometimes I'll find these smaller book shops that have really great selections. And if I follow them, whether or not they have like a lot of followers or anything, they can open up kind of more rabbit holes into researching different types of artists or photographers that I didn't know about. But then I also subscribe to like, newsletters and certain publishers that I like. I really like Triple Canopy, for instance. Asia Art Archive has some really great stuff. And then, like independent film theaters, which are all closed right now, but have such great curation and galleries that have, yearly digital and physical curation. I kind of look to them for more guidance.
Did you see any good films this year?
I finally watched Afterlife. which was really good.
What'd you think about it?
I mean, it was funny because I saw The Lobster first, and I feel like he was very influenced by kind of the whole concept of afterlife. I like that he kind of just let the characters talk, and I'm kind of curious even to see how much of it was the actors speaking for themselves and how much of it was scripted.
What's the one where it's about the kids, the 4 kids?
Nobody knows.
I think in that one, when they were working together with the kids, they would ask the kids to journal every day, and they would use that material also for scripting or for insights. So I wonder if they did something similar with the crew.
Yeah, it seems like that because it doesn't feel as though you could even make up this whole story just from scripting. I guess it also made me think of like my own memories and trying to think what I would have chosen, and then realizing that I don't necessarily experience the present with the idea that I should remember these moments.
Do you have one in mind?
No, that's the thing. I like really couldn't think of one specific thing, or like, I guess in a way I almost started attaching it to people I really cared about in my life and trying to find like specific memory with that person. But I have to think about it more. It's a hard question. It's a really hard question. Yeah. Oh, I saw this really good short film on Criterion.
What was it about?
I'm forgetting the name right now, but it starts with an A, and it's about LGBTQ Black individuals in the 80s, and it starts with like an interview of this one guy talking about his first experience with a man. Yeah, the interviews are really, really great, and the sound mixing was really cool. And then I watched this back in 2019, so I don't know if it's this year, but I really loved Atlantics. It's about this like young couple in Senegal, and the boy decides to go along with the other young men there on a ship to Spain as a way to immigrate, and then the girl stays behind, and it becomes this kind of ghost story, but it's really beautiful. The acting is really good, and the music's composed by Fatima Al-Qadiri. And I got so into that movie, I reached out to her for this book and got kind of a short interview, but I was excited about that too. We were supposed to do a photo shoot, but it like was scheduled exactly for the lockdown dates, so it never happened. But it's okay. But if you haven't watched it, you should. It's a really interesting. It's like really beautiful, and it's always so exciting to see movies that come out now and are well thought out and feel different than everything else that's out there.
Yeah, I've been generally quite sad by the lack of good recent films.
It is on Netflix, but it's good.
I'm gonna find it on another way. Did you see the latest Shion Sono film that came out this year?
No, I haven't. Yeah, sometimes it's tough though to know where to find it, especially when they're out of, just out of festivals and things. There's usually not as much distribution available.
Same with music, is now people can't really tour, and just the financials, how the redistribution of the economy is going to function.
Yeah, it's going to be a challenge.
Are you relying mostly on online sales for your book?
Yeah, and I always have, although, any of the book fairs have always helped just like reach people that maybe wouldn't have come across it in Instagram algorithms. But also like physically, it's always really nice to show the book. A lot of the sales come from online.
Are you still looking at any other magazines?
Like, do I subscribe to any?
Uh-huh.
I subscribe to this like very small cooking magazine called Cooking Illustrated, or Cook Illustrated, just because it's simple and they draw a lot, which is nice.
Are you cooking a lot?
Yeah.
What do you like to cook?
Mostly just cook different forms of tofu and vegetables.
What's your go-to vegetable?
I love pea shoots if I can get them, and then broccoli rabe I really like as well.
I like the for you guys with the mail out, the little I look forward to those actually.
The newsletters?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was kind of a way to try to combat the short Instagram formats. I just felt like, especially during, the height of the protests and everything, I wanted to provide something to the people I reach that was more in depth and more reflective than just an Instagram post. But I also didn't want to necessarily create new content because I feel like there's so much already out there that is probably more valuable than someone like me who has not studied this for my whole life, or like is not I haven't faced too much racism in comparison to others. So I just felt like it made more sense for me to learn more about subjects while simultaneously digesting them and regurgitating them out in a more, I guess, curated way so that you can kind of get the best of what I've researched. Yeah, that's really where it came out from. And it's sometimes tough to get through doing because it really is like hours of researching stuff on the internet or trying to read through books. So I started them at once every 2 weeks, but it kind of got a little overwhelming. So I've made them monthly, and I also have I have plans to have more kind of guest curators also, just because I don't think I should be the only person making the selections, especially when it's on something that I'm less familiar with. But they're exciting. Yeah, I'm actually excited to see like what the people I asked to do the newsletter come back with, because it's always something I haven't really heard about before.
Do you get much responses from the content that you're putting out, like people engaging or even people that have a different opinion?
Yeah, definitely with the one I did on sports, there were a lot of responses from French people who were a little upset. But when I talked to them, they were all pretty understanding, and we actually had interesting conversations. And then I get emails kind of responding to the reflection questions section of the newsletter. I just have, small dialogues with them back and forth through email, just about their thoughts on the subject.
What were some of the French responses that they were having issues with?
I mean, it really was because of this one quote from a French Arabic soccer player that just said, if I score, I'm French. If I don't, I'm Arab. And I think they were just kind of upset, saying that I think one guy brought up like that the guy isn't a good person and that he's been known to, I can't remember what it was, but maybe like might be a sexist person or something. Although when I talked to them, I was kind of like, the subject we were talking about was more of like a broad thing on how countries either claim or don't claim people of mixed or different ethnicities within sports. The biggest example right now being, Naomi Osaka, who has, 3 identities really, and who gets to claim that, or how she chooses to be identified versus how others like force her identification or her identity. But some French people were just getting a little upset, being like, this isn't true. French people aren't that racist, or like, we celebrate and like all of our sports celebrities, I guess, or sports members, despite what race they are. But when I talked to them more about, the context of the quote, they understood it and agreed. And that's the saddest thing I think about, or that's the most frustrating thing I see about social media and these kind of viral quotes outside of context. If it was a longer discussion, not online, usually not on comments, because we've all seen how comments end up going. But if you have a kind of dialogue in person where you are open to other people's perspectives or understanding that things aren't, just black and white, then I do feel like most people kind of generally agree, or at least are closer to understanding the other person's perspective. And I wish there was like a way to incorporate that into digital communication, because it's so important.
It's a tough one. I've been having some personal issues with some of these discussions because, on one sense, I think people in person or publicly are relatively agreeable and don't want to be too long in a confrontation. However, I am also suspicious as to the invisible racism or ignorance about certain subjects and the double signals that people put out, both individually as well as collectively. France, for example, with regards to Islamophobia, is exploding to a point where it seems to be quite okay for a lot of ignorant statements that comes out from even around the dinner table, let's say. of course, when quoted, I think that's the issue, right? Like when one-on-one you have conversations about things, people generally have nice things to say, but usually the policies or the actions of a nation doesn't really reflect that, or the actions of the state doesn't really reflect these things.
Right. And that same person could be speaking to a different group of people that have different values or ideas of race and like change their opinion as well in comparison to like what they would say to someone who they know would be less inclined to any sort of racially like inappropriate opinion. It's tough.
I lived in Italy for 5 years, and I grew up in Australia where I really had to integrate. And there was the same thing in Italy where you try not to rock the boat, but there's so many instances of just outright racism, but it's so casual or so invisible that people don't really acknowledge it. And it's interesting, for example, this statement that, from this quote, and there's so many of these other issues, which is when I find that when I call out people on that, and not even in an aggressive way, the fear of being, this is the concept about white fragility, is just how difficult it is to have an actual discussion without having people go completely on the defense and complete denial.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's definitely scary to be confronted with an idea that you're like unjust or you've done something wrong, I think most people's reaction to being told they're kind of doing something that's wrong is a sense that defensiveness because you don't think at the time that you're doing anything wrong. I really, really, really benefited from watching that documentary Color of Fear. That was...
Oh, yeah.
Especially just because you see the dynamic of, in my opinion, because I was seeing the dynamic of the one, white guy that felt like he wasn't a racist, and then everyone else was like, no, you're pretty ignorant. And that he only really started to understand where they were coming from or see that he was actually maybe at fault after he started addressing his own trauma with his dad. I keep feeling like if people were able to address their own traumas or their own insecurities and accept those, I think they'd be able maybe to be more empathetic to people who maybe don't experience the same sorts of traumas, but are affected by things that may not, affect the person. I just think it would be, I kind of wish that everyone could have really good outlets for mental health and how to just accept and address pain that you've gone through or anything like that. I just really think it would make people more understanding of each other.
Yeah, so much of that is so invisible.
Yeah, you don't know until someone tells you. A lot of the times you don't even know that you're affected by something emotionally until maybe it bubbles up into something bigger where it actually catches your attention. But I don't think it's kind of the same thing with like microaggressions. You don't realize you're affected by it until one day you realize like, oh wait, I'm actually like really, I get so closed off when I meet this certain type of person, or if someone says something like this, I'm not really sure why I get upset, but I get upset, So yeah, sometimes it's just hard to actually pinpoint these things that are affecting you.
Did you ever do therapy yourself?
Yeah, I did. I did last year for about a year. I think it helped. I feel like it was pretty standard. But before that, I've also, meditated and journaled, like written a lot, trying to like understand my own feelings about things that I've experienced, or especially if I feel, sad or upset, like I usually write it out and try to figure out where it's coming from. And I think it's been like very beneficial to me.
You said that you don't experience as much racism as potentially some other people. For you, how was it to be aware of some of these concepts, if, for example, that you never really saw it firsthand?
I definitely have experienced more like subtle racism throughout life, and then just witnessing it, because sometimes I would be in a group of people that are predominantly one race or the other and see how like easily they speak about other races, in usually kind of condescending ways. So I've kind of seen it across all communities, honestly. Like, just, it really does also depend on the person. Besides that, I've read some books and movies like Moonlight, for instance. Like, it's maybe not necessarily the best movie in the world, but it's such a specific perspective that I will never experience because I'm not, a gay Black man. It like really helped me see something that I wouldn't experience on my own, but I can like relate to in a human sense, in more of like an empathic way, but maybe never have thought about that happening, those kind of experiences happening to someone, or those defense mechanisms happening to someone because of how they've been treated in the past. Like before that movie, it didn't really occur to me that the idea of using masculinity as a guard, because I've never had to do that. Even that, I mean, I think that's a good movie, but even like bad cinema, I can learn something from. I watched Ford versus Ferrari, and I feel like I learned something from that because that's directed to a certain audience. And so by watching it, I'm seeing what like that audience appreciates or like wants to see, or why they react certain ways.
I've been exploring masculinity question I've been asking the people that I've been interviewing. Do you have some, like, what does it conjure up for you at this moment, specifically about Asian masculinity?
I can understand someone's need to feel masculine based on the way like most societies are built and the value that's built into it, and the expectation put onto someone. I do think it can be very toxic, not only for people around them, but for the person themselves, just because they're putting so much expectation on themselves to be a certain way and to hide certain things. And I think that's really unhealthy. I think it can be really unfortunate that a lot of Asian men feel the need to be masculine, and how they choose to prove that masculinity, because sometimes it can reinforce certain stereotypes or exclude certain people or ideas from being part of their identity. I've found Asian American men to really value white women in comparison to Black women or Asian women, because it makes them feel more valuable or something, or as if they've accomplished something. And I don't necessarily blame them for it, because I feel like, I mean, it's completely understandable. There was like a quote I read actually in, I think, Frantz Fanon's
Black Skin, White Mask?
Yeah. The idea is, I think it's essentially just like putting value in who you're associating yourself with, and how close of proximity you can get to the kind of power and status that are often granted to people who are white masculine men. The thing is, it's all understandable. The same with Asian people in general, trying to associate themselves more often with white individuals than other races, because sometimes it can actually lead to a higher status or a way out of poverty for the rest of their family in the next generations. Those things are actually real. It's not like that's not something that actually happens in real life. While I think like we should be aware of it and try to prevent that kind of bias from happening, I don't think anyone who's kind of ended up doing that is necessarily crazy or anything. I think it's all pretty understandable.
Yeah, it's this idea of white affirmation.
Mm-hmm. But there is also alternatively, such a really positive affirmation for being part of a real community of people who identify similarly to you. And I find that could be more rewarding. It's kind of like intrinsic and extrinsic motivations. Like, do you find more positive reinforcement by being like accepted for who you are, or having a community of people, and all these kind of like intangible things? Do you value more success and status and materialistic things? It's kind of a similar argument,
and that's kind of a thing that is up to the individual as well.
Mm-hmm.
But overall, the pressure of the mainstream society and the system has its toll.
Yeah, but I can really see why someone who may not have that much security in their basic needs, like a good home, ways to pay for things, and if they feel like they don't have enough of that, I could see why it would matter more to move up, as you say.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that happens on both sides of the gender.
Yeah, it does.
There's also like a layer of Stockholm syndrome, trying to relate with the colonizers. Do you watch any of the All Gas No Breaks?
Yes, I do.
You know that one where I think it was the Trump Jr.'s book signing?
Yeah, I just saw that like 2 days ago.
Oh, yeah, the one where, and then there's that woman, the Black woman, who was going on about her slave master, and quite intense.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting phenomenon.
I mean, you can definitely feel more comfortable if you just look at the bright side of what situation you're in, which is kind of how I feel like she approached it.
Yeah, everybody's got to make their own decision, and it's just hard to see sometimes.
Yeah.
I find myself in this kind of interesting position living in Berlin. I realized that this was kind of the age when my parents emigrated from Taiwan to Australia.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we really had to assimilate and fit in. I kind of hear that same thing as well, and the same kind of on me now to feel like I have to assimilate into German culture. I sense a massive fear from this idea. Also, the idea of nation states and nation identities. It's like we're all in some massive football game.
Mm-hmm.
What is your point of view about concepts of nations, and do you see yourself as more American or Italian or Taiwanese?
I mean, it definitely changes throughout life, I think. But I feel like I've mostly associated myself with New York specifically. Never really associated with being American. Actually, was pretty disappointed. I mean, I think the main time I really realized what I was perceived as and like what Americans looked like to other people was when I studied in Florence, because there's so many American students there. And I was shocked because I didn't feel like I saw that in New York. I didn't think we looked like this specific type of person. Italian American, I kind of relate to, but I've always felt like an outsider in my more extended family on my dad's side. And then Taiwanese, I only recently, as in like the last 10 years, really got to know my family on that side and that culture. But I feel like I've been kind of growing more fond of it and more proud of the accomplishments and the things they do. I feel like I celebrate that a lot.
Why is that?
I almost feel like I'm lucky to have been born part Taiwanese because I think they're doing such a good thing. And as far as legalizing gay marriage in Asia is sadly like a slow thing to happen. And the way how they're kind of fighting the pandemic, I think they're pretty impressive. And then just all the Taiwanese people I've met so far are great people. So I definitely am happy to be Taiwanese. But I think I've associated mostly in general, like overarching throughout my life as just being Asian as a whole.
But you mentioned you grew up with your father.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Your mom wasn't around, or you lived in different places?
She moved back to Taiwan when I was 2 and just didn't really have much communication with her until I was I think we didn't talk or see each other at all from maybe 8 years old to 16. And before that, it was maybe once every 2 years she'd be in New York for some reason. We would just see her for about a day or two. But then once I actually had to get my passport renewed and was still underage, I had to get her signature technically because my dad never got full custody. So we contacted her and then we started kind of talking more, and then she invited my brother and I to Taiwan when I was 18. So that's the first time I ever went as an adult or as a conscious human, because I think I went once when I was 2 when she first moved back, but I don't remember that. So it was a bit more of a new experience, or more of an adult experience with that part of my family. But growing up, I don't look that Italian, so I've always kind of been identified as Asian. And my dad pushed pretty hard to get both my brother and I interested in Asian cultures. He's also very interested in Asian culture. So we kind of so he was into this Indian spiritual group called Ananda Marga from when he was about 17, I think, until we were maybe 17. We would go every week, and it's predominantly Indian and Filipino monks. So I was definitely surrounded by a lot of different Asian cultures growing up. And then he got into this Korean Taoism group later on that we also went to meetings, chanting kind of Sundays.
How did you like that as a kid?
So from childhood, I was going to meditation. And then when I was about 16, I think for a couple of years, we went to the Taoist group meetings. I preferred, I was a child, so I preferred the Korean meetings because they had better food, in my opinion. But I value, now looking back at it, I value both, I think the meditation was actually really helpful and some of the people were really good people and had interesting outtakes on politics and spirituality. And ultimately, very giving people. They The spiritual group we were with, they function globally and do a lot of giving back.
What was your perception or your image of your mom as a kid, though? Because you didn't really keep in touch during that time.
I mean, I didn't really know anything about her. So I just kind of thought of her as like not really existing for a while. And then when we got to know each other, I was like, whoa, she's a lot more Asian than I realized. She went through a few style changes. When I first met her, she was like completely decked out in anisui with like a perm and red hair, you know. It's like it was interesting. And then when I met my Taiwanese family, when I first went back, I was pretty shocked by the dynamic of like making fun of individuals in your family as a way to connect. It took a while for me to get used to. I was kind of affected by that.
Yeah, that can be tough. I'm still affected by that.
Yeah. That's one thing I wish would phase out of Asian culture is making fun of your family members. I have this one cousin they used to call Jumbo because he was like a little fat kid. And now he's just a really skinny teenager who plays like nonstop Fortnite. So I wonder how much of that is affected him or if it was something else, you know? It's hard to say.
Are you in better contact now with your mother?
Yeah, we like text from time to time, and I try to go there once a year or like 2 years for like a little bit of a longer amount of time. So definitely we have more of a relationship now. And it's cool because she's very creative. She's a choreographer. It's interesting to kind of see someone who she considers herself a black sheep of her family for choosing the arts. She's very dedicated to it.
What about the language barrier?
Her English is pretty good. She met my dad in New York when she was studying. She was getting her master's at NYU for dance. And she works a lot with foreign musicians and opera people and stuff. So I think they all kind of just speak English to each other. So she's pretty good at it. But the rest of my family on that side doesn't really speak English. So that's always been a challenge. I really want to learn Chinese. I keep thinking like now is the time to do it when I have more time. Also maybe thinking about going there and trying to take classes while I'm there.
What town are they in?
Well, my mom lives in Taipei, but there's like family throughout the entire country, really. And both my grandparents have like 9 siblings, so I think there's like family everywhere. Definitely I have an uncle in Kaohsiung too.
Yeah, I went back last year to film with my family. Yeah, it was interesting to have camera apparatus between me and them and to kind of observe them from that lens, as opposed to my memory of being a child in that context, because there's a part of me that has such a different perspective on the world and on myself and how I understand them. Like there's the part of me that understands the Taiwanese mentality, but there's also part of me that sees it from a foreign perspective that is so confused and disturbed by these little quirks. And it's quite a challenge to come to terms with that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, my grandmother, she's on my dad's side, is the only one still left from that generation. And my dad employed a Vietnamese caretaker for her, a live-in.
Right.
So there's also like kind of a layer of colonization there too, of like a lower GDP nation. And that was quite heartbreaking to see them living together and quite mad in this way where, yeah, it's another layer of colonization and another layer of oppression and suffering.
For sure. I think that's really important also. I think a lot of the times when we talk about Asia, I think it's important to include internal racism of other Asians towards other Asians and not exclude Southeast and South Asians and West Asians in comparison within like these more westernized or more these richer countries in Asia and how they treat their people outside of them. You know, the migrant workers, their perception of, like you said, you know, Thai or Filipino, Malaysian individuals. It's definitely disappointing when I see it happen.
Also within Asia, I think like the relationship to money and economy is such a big part of people's lives. It's generally a lot more materialistic, and I can also understand why, and it makes me sad as well. I remember having some friends and they were visiting Lulu Yao, which is like a island off the coast of Taiwan, and there is a group of indigenous people that live there. I wanted to go and film them too and interview those guys because they would speak about the mainlanders which is interesting because in Taiwan, usually when you refer to the mainlanders, you're referring to the Chinese oppression on the mainland. But for the people on Lüdao,
Yeah.
they actually, was it Lüdao or Landao? Green or blue? Anyway, they were really upset with the mainlanders referring to Taiwan mainland because they were dumping all of their nuclear waste to that island, basically neglecting the way of life of the people there and oppressing so much of their social and political aspects of their well-being. So it's just interesting to see how it trickles down, and like you said, also the way that there is this kind of colonizing effect of Filipinos, Vietnamese workers who come for higher wage work compared to their home countries.
I mean, yeah, that's the thing. It's like it's kind of in probably every culture or nation as a whole, some sort of bias or like need to find yourself above someone else. Just wondering what we can do to change that.
I don't know, the idea of power and power structures is pretty hard I'm not sure if it's really possible to remove completely. It's just the way that nature is perhaps constructed some way. These dynamics, it's usually replaced when it's torn apart. When do you think you'll go back to Taiwan next?
I keep playing with the idea of going back, like, now.
I thought of, in my panic, I nearly went to Taiwan when COVID first started.
Yeah.
I thought it was like the end of the world.
It wouldn't be a bad idea.
Funny enough, my parents, who are Taiwanese, live in Australia, they're very suspicious about the government's numbers about their COVID status.
Right. Well, I was going to say, my mom as well was saying that they've been kind of blaming it on Filipino workers coming in. They say that a lot of any of the outbreaks are kind of the fault of some foreign people coming in, which is probably partially a possibility. But then there's also some kind of unexplained records of Japanese or Filipino people coming out of Taiwan and testing positive.
It's interesting how it reveals people's prejudice with these instant theories.
Yeah, like who to blame.
Also, the idea of blame with coronavirus I find very hilarious. There's definitely the people that are really looking for the origin story or the people to blame. I find it really perverse and quite interesting.
I know, I kind of feel like we're all to blame, especially for the spreads.
I wonder if it's really even the right way to think, this blaming mentality.
Right.
It's just nature.
Right.